Now talking back to you.
Okay, now we're in. Okay, hi everybody. I'd like to welcome you to another segment of our series called the RMEDS Medical Ethics and Halakha series, where we this is part of an ongoing 6-part lecture series, a series of shiurim given by different rabbis in the community. And we're very grateful to RMEDS Pharmacy and Yechiel Reis, the proprietor. And the shiur tonight is dedicated to the Refuah Shleima for Aharon Elimélech ben Bryndel, Bluma bas Maasha, and Yehudit bas Feygã. They should all have a Refuah Shleima. And it is dedicated for an Aliyas Neshama for 2 very special women who recently left this world as part of Yechiel's family, his grandmother Miral bas Levi Yosef, and his mother Sarah Gitel bas Dov, and their neshamas have an aliyah. Okay, so our discussion tonight is on cosmetic tattoos. How many of you have looked into this before? Actually, my wife was the one who originally asked me this question because she had heard about it from her friends, and she was really interested because it's a real convenience to, let's say, apply eyebrows or eyeshadow one time, and it's there for 3 years. And then you only have to get it reapplied once every few years. What about medical tattoos that are applied for medical procedures? What about for a person who has experienced some kind of disfigurement? Frank, what's the name of that condition with the blotched skin? What is it called?
You mean vitiligo?
Vitiligo, yeah. So that's a condition, that people who have uneven pigmentation and would want to be able to avoid embarrassment, so they would fill in the white spots with a tattoo substance. Okay, all of these things they sound fine, right? But we have to look at that in the light of one of the 613 mitzvot, where the Torah specifically prohibits what's called ketovet ka'aka, which is a process of tattooing. We call it tattooing. It's where a needle is inserted, and then a dye is inserted in the hole that is created by the needle, and that creates a permanent or semi-permanent pigmentation or coloration of the skin. That's what the Torah prohibits. Just to let you know, I'm referencing 2 really important articles on this subject. One was written in English in 2009 by J. David Bleich on this very topic, Survey of Recent Halakhic Periodical Literature, Medical and Cosmetic Tattooing. That was both done for Tradition magazine or journal and for the Cardozo Law School Journal. And then the other one is from Tchumen Volume 10, which was done in 50 something. I don't remember the exact year, but it's done about 30 years ago by Harav Ezra Batzri Shlita, who is a respected posek in Yerushalayim and Eretz Yisrael. And he wrote also a very important article on this subject. So from Rabbi Bleich's article, he just says what medical and cosmetic tattoos can be used for. He says medical tattoos, which is called micropigmentation, it is now widely used in cranio-facial surgery, plastic and reconstructive procedures, cosmetic surgery, breast reconstruction, and ophthalmology. It has potentially life-saving benefit in conjunction with radiation therapy, endoscopic surgery, and an ultrasound-guided localization of nonpalpable breast lesions. It is also of value in marking the position of breast tissue prior to chemotherapy, designed to shrink the tumor so that a radical mastectomy may be avoided and the tumor excised by means of surgery. So these are helpful. This is medically helpful. One thing we should probably surmise without too much research is that in the event that a tattoo is necessary for life-saving procedures, then ein davar omed lifnei pikuach nefesh, then nothing stands in the way of a life-saving procedure, provided, of course, that that's the only means available to be able to save the life. Just like you can eat non-kosher food to save a life, you can also get a tattoo to save a life. So the question really becomes, when it's non-life threatening and it helps for medical purposes, can it be sanctioned because of specific issues that we're going to be raising tonight? And for cosmetic use, he writes, the novel use of micropigmentation for cosmetic makeup dates to 1984 with the perfection of tattooing of eyelids to produce permanent eyeliner by Gloria Eng. Micropigmentation has been similarly employed for purposes of lip lining, also for enhancing a woman's cheeks and the coloration and the blush in her cheeks, and also for filling in, let's say, a person who has hair loss. Sometimes it is used for those cosmetic purposes as well. So let's talk about what the issues are. First of all, let's look at the Torah. What does the Torah say? V'seret lanefesh lo titenu bivsarchem. You may not place any kind of scratch on your body. Uchetovet ka'aka lo titenu bachem. And do not place ketovet ka'aka, which we translate as tattooing. Ani Hashem, I am Hashem. Okay? Now, it seems pretty straightforward. But the Mishnah in Masechet Makot really explains to us what the nature of the prohibition is. First of all, can anyone think of why the Torah would prohibit tattooing ourselves? Why should this be prohibited?
That's right.
It's related to Avodah Zarah. It's actually codified in the Shulchan Aruch in the laws of Avodah Zarah, of idolatry. What's that?
Tzelem is like a cross.
Yeah, well, they didn't have crosses in the times of the Bible. It's an image. It may be an image. The question is, what if I don't do an image? What if I just write "mom" on my upper arm? Hubba hubba, whatever. I don't know, whatever the soldiers used to write. I don't know, or the sailors, right? What's wrong with that? So in the ancient world, people used to, as the Sefer HaChinuch writes, people used to write the name of their idolatry on a tattoo on their body, expressing their devotion and dedication to their deity. So that leads us to the question, what is the scope of this commandment? Are all kinds of tattooing prohibited, or are only limited kinds of tattooing prohibited? So let's take a look at the Mishnah. First of all, one of the first things we're going to see in the Mishnah is that there's a machlokes as to the scope of this prohibition. The first opinion of the Mishnah, hakotev ketovet ka'aka, katav velo ki'aka velo katav, eno chayav ad shichtov v'yikakeya bidyo uvekechol uvechol davar shuhu roshem. The Mishnah says that you're only liable if you do the two-step process. You have to make a scratch or a puncture in the skin, and then you have to insert the ink, okay? But if you do one and you don't do the other, if you only write a permanent ink on the skin, or without making any kind of incision or a puncture in the skin, or if you simply make a puncture in the skin and try to get the blood, let's say, to act as the dye, that also is not a biblical violation. And then we have a second opinion. So the first opinion says any kind of tattooing that involves that two-step process of both incising and placing ink is a violation of the Torah. However, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, mishum Rabbi Shimon Omer, eino chayav ad shichtov shem Hashem. Shenemar uchetovet ka'aka lo titenu bachem ani Hashem. That you're not liable until you write the name of your idolatry. That's how the Meforshim understand it. And that's the reason, when you think about it, that's logical, because that's the reason why you are committing an offense, because you're doing an act of idolatrous devotion. Okay? And it says, Shenemar uchetovet ka'aka lo titenu bachem ani Hashem. God says, just like I am Hashem, and if you were to worship me, I wouldn't want this worship done. So too, do not do it for other deities as well. And so therefore you see from the formation of the verse that it has to do with devoting yourself to your deity by writing the name of your deity. And therefore, according to this second opinion, it's much more limited. Putting mom with a heart on your shoulder if you're a soldier, or the name of your girlfriend, or an eagle, or whatever people do, that would not be prohibited at all, according to this second opinion. Now, how do we paskin? So the Chidushe HaRitva tells us that the majority of the poskim of his time, he's a Rishon, he's a medieval commentator on the Talmud, he says that the majority opinion is according to the first opinion. That's what we call the Tanakama. And therefore, all tattoos are going to be prohibited, even if it doesn't contain the name of the deity. However, he says, it should be noted that both the Rif and the Rush, two very important Halakhic decisors, do paskin like the second opinion. And therefore, for them, it's much more limited, this prohibition. So our first conclusion, and we're just making some notes as we go down through the notes. Our first conclusion is that there is a machlokas rishonim as to whether we paskin like the Rabbanan, or the first opinion, or like Reb Shimon. Now we have another point that needs to be made, which is the Minchas Chinuch. And he engages in a discussion of what will be if I take permanent ink and I just write it on my skin. You know, what do we do among some of the Sephardim? We do a henna before the wedding. And in the henna, what do they have? They have this, it's the name of the dye. And they put it on the palm of the hand, and it stays on for a few weeks sometimes. Okay? Is that a problem of tattooing? So you're going to say, well, it's not permanent, but it's meant to stay on for quite some time. Could that be a problem of tattooing? So it doesn't penetrate the skin. So the question is, and this is something that the Minchas Chinuch deliberates, what if I do one and not the other, like the Mishnah had said? I'm not in violation of the Torah violation. Is it possible that I will still be over on an Isser D'Rabbanan, on a rabbinic prohibition, which prohibits that further, in which case you couldn't do a henna because it's semi-permanent. We'll see permanence is something that we have to examine, how permanent is permanent. And then we have the question of, let's say I'm a doctor making rounds in the hospital, and I want to be able to make a note to myself, and I don't have a piece of paper. All I have is my pen. And I just want to write something on the back of my hand in order to remind myself about something. Would that be a violation rabbinically? Even if it's not a tattoo, I want it to stay there at least for a certain period of time to remind myself. Are these things prohibited? So,
I mean, there's even the children's little tattoos that last for their
the kids sticker tattoos, yeah, and all of this kinds of stuff. So it seems from the Minchas Chinuch that there is no Isser when the ink is non-permanent, but there may be an Isser D'Rabbanan. He deliberates, he's not 100% sure, when the ink is permanent but was not applied in the tattoo format. He's not sure. It seems that, from what people do, that there's no problem at all. Now, what?
What about Botox filler that's underneath the skin, breaking the skin, but there's no coloration?
Yes, so that would not be a prohibition of tattooing. There may be other issues in Botox. Was it permissible to subject yourself to certain procedures where there may be either risk involved, and that goes under we gave a shiur about rhinoplasty, about a woman getting a nose job, or if Moshe has a tshuva about that, there has to be a compelling reason. In other words, you don't want to go under the knife or under other procedures, although Botox arguably is not under the knife, it's just an injection. So perhaps there's even more reason to be lenient. But let's go on. I want to go to a few other commentaries. Then we have the Pischei Tshuva, who quotes from a sefer called Mi'il Tzedakah. He says, "Shenistapek bidin ketovet ka'aka." This is source number 6. Le'inyan chiyuv malkut iba'inen sheyehi bo otiot asher heim muskamim. Now, in order for a person to be in violation of the biblical infraction of not tattooing, does the tattoo have to have letters? When you think about it, the whole reason why the Torah, at least presumably the reason why the Torah prohibits, is because in the idolatrous ancient world, people would write the name of their deity. Well, what if instead of writing mom on my shoulder, I put on the illustration of an eagle or a serpent, and I write no letters? Would that be a biblical violation of ketovet ka'aka? And the conclusion that the Pitchei Tshuva quotes from the Sefer Me'il Tzedakah, and by the way, if you go back to source number 3 and you look at the Bartenura's commentary, you see that this is alluded to also, and that's why I underlined those 2 words. He says that what is ketovet ka'aka? Mikareya bisakin al bisaro ke'ein otiot. He deliberately says that you make incisions in the skin that are like letters, meaning that you try to resemble letters, and then you fill in those incisions with ink. So it seems clear that there is something having to do with letters that is implied in the biblical prohibition. And therefore, the conclusion of the Pitchei Tshuva is that if you don't use letters, but just pictures, and can you imagine, let's say, a person who wants to get a tattoo to give themselves eyebrows or eye blush and things like that, there's certainly no letters involved. So that's certainly not a biblical prohibition either. At most, it's a rabbinic prohibition. And that's what the poskim agree to, that there's only a rabbinic prohibition here. The Shulchan Aruch tells us something else, source number 7. Haroshem al avdo shelo yivrach patur. What if I own a slave and I want to make sure that the slave doesn't run away? And if he does run away, I'll be able to identify him. See that, Toby, you my slave, and we're going to put a brand on you. We're going to put a tattoo. We're going to put a tattoo on you. And it's not because I like tattoos, not because I want my slave to be tattooed. It's purely for identification purposes, so that if he runs away, we'll be able to track him down and find him. So you're putter. You have not committed the violation. Now, what's the reason? We'll see that in just a second. But the Ramah says that nonetheless, midorabanan, it's still usher. So there's no biblical prohibition because you're not doing it for the sake of having a tattoo, but there's still a rabbinic prohibition. The Sefer Get Pashut deals with this question. He says, V'yesh lehitponein ma'itaimahu patur. Why are you not committing the biblical infraction if you put a tattoo on your slave? He says, the lochia v'torah ela k'sha'oseh ketovet ka'aka mishum ha'ketiva gufa. He says, because you're only liable if you make the tattoo for the sake of the tattoo itself. You want to either beautify the body or use the tattoo as some kind of religious symbol, etc. However, and that's, he says, Kamosha osim hagoyim bechukotehem, as the non-Jewish idolaters, the pagans, do in their religion. Ach ba'osech chotam be'evet shelo yivrach patur. But my reason for putting a tattoo on a servant is just to prevent him from running away and not being able to retrieve him. So it's not for the sake of the tattoo, it's for the sake of some other reason. And just like we have this concept of melacha she'ina tzricha legufa, if I do something that is perhaps forbidden on Shabbos, but not for the sake of the way that the melacha is normally done. So for example, let's say the Torah does not permit me to harvest plants on Shabbos. I'm not allowed to pull out plants out of the ground. But let's say I'm not doing it in order to harvest plants. Let's say I'm doing it because I need some soil, and I pull out some soil together with some weeds that are growing from that soil. So technically, I have not done the biblical malacha. I've only done a rabbinic prohibition, okay, of tolesh. The same thing could be said with the prohibition of making a tattoo. I haven't done the technical prohibition of tattoos for the sake of a tattoo, but it's nonetheless rabbinically prohibited. So we've got one derabanan of that you're not making letters. You've got another derabanan that you're not doing it for the sake of the tattoo. And let's see, and we also know that there's one opinion, at least in the Rishonim, that you're not in violation unless you do it for the sake of idolatry, for this, and you write the name of the deity. So now we get to another responsum, which is source number 9. And the question is, what is considered permanent? So Rav Gestetner in Lahorot Natan, Rav Gestetner was a 20th century posek, and he writes that when the Torah prohibits ketovet ka'aka, he notes something interesting. He says, Rashi in his commentary says, ketovet ka'aka is ketav ha'mechuke v'shakua she'eino nimchak le'olam, that it's completely permanent. It never goes away. And so some people want to argue that if you have a tattoo that is not completely permanent, such that it'll fade over the course of 2-3 years, which is what cosmetic tattoos typically do, then maybe you could allow it because it doesn't fall under the rubric of the biblical prohibition. However, Rav Gestetner rejects that possibility, quoting the Nimuke Yosef, who says that it's v'nikeret sham zman gadol, that it's there for a protracted period of time. He doesn't say how long that period of time has to be, but he argues that when Rashi says that it's there la'olam, which means forever, it doesn't really necessarily mean forever. I mean, after all, you're going to tell me that if a person has a tattoo for their entire life and in the last few minutes of their life it starts to fade, he's not in violation? No. So the answer is that la'olam means for an extended period of time. And so therefore the conclusion is that whether a cosmetic tattoo is absolutely permanent or is meant to remain for a prolonged period of time, 2-3 years, the halacha will remain the same. So we get to the conclusion of Rav Batzri in that article in Techumin. And I want to take a look at it with you together, just two important paragraphs where he gives us the bottom line. He says, Benidon Didan. He says, in our case, what was he dealing with? This is in the 1990s when he's writing this responsum. And the question that he received was, a woman has no eyebrows, and she would like to get this cosmetic procedure where the eyebrows will be tattooed in, and the artist, I'm sorry if I'm using the wrong term, the technician who will make the eyebrows, it will do it in such a way where it looks very natural. It looks like real eyebrows. And her reason for wanting to do this is because it's embarrassing, because she looks unusual if she's walking around without eyebrows. So is she permitted to do this? That was the question. And this is what caused Rav Batzri to go through this whole review of the literature and to sort of try and ascertain whether this is okay or it's not okay. So he says, Benidon didan she'ein otiot. So let's recognize, number one, there's no letters. So certainly according to that opinion that said that when there's no letters, there's no biblical prohibition, that's one thing in our favor. Rak roshem ba'alma kedei shetera'eh ba'alat se'ar. All you're doing is making markings on her skin that it should look like she has hair there. Yesh litzaref lisvarot hanal svarazu she'eno mitkavein lektovet ka'aka. Your intention is not for a tattoo, like we saw in this argument from the Get Pashut as to why it's permissible to put a tattoo on your servant. The kaven shekain yesh lahatir gam lechatchila. And therefore, he argues that this should be permitted, even though at most there's an Isser D'Rabbanan, and normally with an Isser D'Rabbanan, we normally say you can't do it, but here he feels we can permit it even L'chatchila. Keven shekan hatsura she'osim kein begavot kishe'ein sarot, zu hochacha berura she'ein hakavana la'avodah zara u'lechetovet ka'aka, im kein yesh lahatir afilu l'chatchila. He says, because the very careful placement of the markings on the place where no eyebrows would normally be is clearly an indication that there's no intention for idolatry here. So when you put all of these things together, he says there is such now a diminished concern here. There's no semblance to the biblical prohibition. There's no writing of letters. And it's not being done for the purpose of having a tattoo, but rather to look like you have hair. For all of those reasons, he says you can permit it even lechatchila. And therefore, Rav Batzri is completely permissive for a cosmetic procedure like this. And so that's the next paragraph. And the next page, perhaps, the next page is where he says the issue of emotional distress. He says, Od yesh bazeh mishum kavod habriot. He says there's an additional argument that has to be made to be permissive, and that's what's called kavod habrios, where we find many times that our sages suspended a rabbinic prohibition if abiding by the law will cause embarrassment to a person, will cause a person to feel inhibited, that they can't go out in public, or that they feel very uncomfortable whenever they are seen in public. That's called kavod habrios. The Torah is very concerned that people should be respected and should be accorded dignity. Because people look very different from the rest of the population. It's so interesting psychologically what we view as being unusual in people's faces. We tend to pick up on strange little idiosyncrasies, and it just piques our curiosity. If a person comes along and doesn't have eyebrows, we make a mental note saying that person looks strange. When really, why should eyebrows
serves no useful purpose.
Eyebrows serve no useful purpose, except maybe to keep the dandruff out of my eyes. I'm not sure if that's why God made eyebrows. I have no idea. Yeah. Yeah, or a big nose also, although that's not related to tattoos right now. He said, so it's a whole shaila whether a man is allowed to wear a wig. I don't know.
Women's
Are they?
That's, in my opinion, that's not called kavod habrios because there are many bald men. It's not.
It's more common, but when I was growing up, when you were growing up, bald men they all wear wigs.
Really?
No,
Except for you,
today everyone just shave. Today when you start losing your hair, you just shave. Today bald is
Much more acceptable.
much more
It's it.
acceptable.
Yeah.
40
Yeah.
years ago, 50 years ago, what?
But that's still an embarrassment for you. But if it's-
That's emotional distress for a young guy.
Yeah, so we have to know what kavod habriot means, and we're going to be taking a conservative definition of kavod habriot, and that is if the majority of people would be embarrassed with this kind of either disfigurement or unusual appearance, then there's more reason to be lenient. A person may be personally uncomfortable, like lahavdil, Michael Jackson didn't want to be black. So could we say that for kavod habrios, he's allowed to violate the Torah and disfigure himself because of that? He didn't want to have a black nose, so he disfigured himself, right? Would that be sanctionable because of kavod habrios? I don't think so, but the issue of looking unusual, that most people would make a mental note that this is unusual, this looks out of place, or this looks different, that we can certainly say falls under the category of kavod habrios. He says, "V'nire ke'adam mishuneh v'yesh bazeh bizayon gadol." He says, when you look different from everybody else, it's very embarrassing, it's degrading. V'gadol kavod habrios shedoche kamet dvarim, v'kan sheladat rov haposkim bevadai ein iser Torah, and therefore, certainly in our case, where there's clearly no biblical violation, clearly not, Yavo kavod habriot v'nuchal lifso kedat haposkim shenirim mehem shemutar lechatchila. Then we can definitely rely on those poskim. So I want to be very clear that Rav Basri is only prepared to be lenient when you have the argument of kavod habrios. If a person has a desire for some kind of cosmetic enhancement, but you don't have the issue of kavod habriot, because let's say it's you want to have more bushy eyebrows, but you already have eyebrows, that you don't look unusual with the eyebrows that you have. Or let's say you want to get permanent blush on your eyelids, which is something that can be done. Or let's say you want your lips to look more lusciously red than they already do naturally, and you don't want to have to be bothered by lipstick, but you want to instead get a tattoo. That would be problematic according to Rav Batsri, because you don't have the added argument of kavod habriot. And while there may not be any biblical violation of ketovet ka'aka, of tattoos, there still remains the rabbinic prohibition. And that seems to be the opinion of Rav Gestetner and the vast majority of poskim, some of whom are completely stringent and don't even permit for kavod habriot. But the majority seem to say that for kavod habriot, when there's a compelling need, if it's to, let's say, address a disfigurement after surgery, and it can be covered up through a tattooing procedure, or a person has a congenital condition like vitiligo, I'm sorry, I keep forgetting the name of the word, vitiligo, then that certainly can be sanctioned. However, Rav Gestetner writes very strong language. He says, "Ladina benidon she'elatenu." He says, in our issue, where there is no kavod habriot issue, but a woman simply wishes to enhance her appearance by using cosmetic tattoos, leka shum makom heter bazeh. There's no basis to be lenient. The imishum de'eno kotev surat otiyot, and he goes through all of the different issues. Rav Vosner and Shevet Halevi writes a similar issue. This is being written in Tafshin Nuntet, again around the same time in the late 90s. He says, he writes, Yikarto ve'hakuntris be'inin ktovet kakal lenachon kibalti. He says, I've gotten your letter and your very interesting collection of notes about the laws of tattooing. And I went over as best as I could in a limited amount of time that I had over your notes. And they are quite worthy words, and you are a Talmud Chacham. And we should therefore be stringent to disallow women to do tattoos for their eyebrows, either because this may be an issue of tattooing, which is prohibited, and he gives another argument, that cosmetic tattoos, when there's no clear disfigurement, may be what he calls shachatz, which is a type of brazenness or arrogance. In other words, it's gaivadik, or it's just like a bold breach of chastity or modesty, or whatever you want to say. He says we know what the Medrash tells us, that women who were a little bit more brazen than the rest were the cause of the destruction of the temple. So Rav Vosner feels that purely for cosmetic purposes, you should not be lenient in this regard. And then finally, the other thing that we wanted to see was from Rav Tauber, who also wrote really around the same time. But this was all circulating, these responsa in the 90s is when this issue became very, very popular. He says, there's still going to be an Isser D'Rabbanan. But he deliberates on the following question. Look at the question that he asks. Ach legabe Isur D'Rabbanan, ulai lo asru rak ha'oseh ka'aka. Avol mi shalimdo mehakafat harosh, shegam al hanase haktovet ka'aka yesh isur, ulai lo asru oto chazal. However, let's say a person wants to get tattoos on his scalp to replicate hair. Okay, he wants to get tattoos on his scalp so that he won't look bald. Do they still do that, by the way? Is that still done? Frank, yeah? No, implants is different.
How real is that gonna look?
No, now they do it
This is ink.
instead of doing it.
So implants is one thing. Implants is not necessarily a problem of tattoos,
Right.
but a person wants to get tattoos instead of implants. He doesn't want to go to Turkey, right? What do they say? Like 90% of the men who go to Turkey are wearing hats, and then when they come home, they're also wearing hats, But anyway, so he says maybe the rabbinic prohibition of getting a tattooed scalp will only be if you do it yourself. But what if you have a non-Jew apply the tattoo on your scalp for you? He says, Ulai lo asru oto chazal, kaven de sof sof hu lo avad ma'aseh. Maybe you could argue that I didn't do anything. I just allowed a non-Jew who has no prohibition. Yeah, well, not if it's biblically prohibited. Like if I want to say Jesus saves and put it as a tattoo on my arm, that is probably going to be usher. That's clearly usher because it's the name of an idolatry, at least for Jews. So therefore, v'im kein mutter lalaso taktovet ka al yedei goy. He says, maybe then you could make that argument. But in the final analysis, he says that, I still think that that should be prohibited, at least rabbinically, but at least that could be another, what we would call another sniff, another layer of leniency to be lenient, as long as I'm not doing it myself, but I'm allowing a non-Jew to apply the cosmetic tattoo, there could be room for leniency. So here's our bottom line. The bottom line is that what we've been able to demonstrate in these few minutes together is that there is clearly no biblical prohibition if A, you're not writing letters on your skin, B, if it's being done not for the sake of having a tattoo, but rather for the sake of, let's say, covering up something that would normally not be what you would not want to see on your body, which is generally speaking what cosmetic tattoos or certainly medical tattoos are for. If it's for a medical procedure, there's room to be lenient for that reason as well. If there's a way of applying the ink in a way that doesn't involve an incision, that also would be a room for leniency. But the halacha will remain the same, whether it's for a permanent tattoo or whether it's meant to be there just for 3 years. That's 3 years is also considered to be a permanent tattoo. So our conclusion would be that if there is an argument of kavod habriot to be made, then we can be completely lenient. If a person is embarrassed and there's really no other way for them to conveniently conceal the thing that is embarrassing to them, they can justify getting a medical or cosmetic tattoo. If, however, it's just to enhance their appearance and they look completely normal without the tattoo, it's harder to justify in the poskim because you don't have the argument of kavod habriot. And that's really the bottom line. I have some links for you if you'd like to research the issue further, but that's yeah, Mark.
What are we between men and women?
There might be, like, for example, like the issue, Shleima raised, the issue of a toupee. There's much more reason to, let's say, to sanction wearing a sheitel for women than there is for sanctioning a man to wear a toupee. It's questionable whether the poskim do deliberate over whether a man can wear a toupee or not. It seems like there's room for leniency. But kavod habriot, I think, would also apply in the realm of tattoos, if you could make the argument that men don't mind this issue as much as women do. Although I have to say, let's say if a man is missing eyebrows, yes, I think that would be something that he would feel self-conscious about also. You'd have to come up with some kind of example where a woman would be more self-conscious than a man.
A man in a job interview with a wig, he looks younger, he'll get the job.
Yeah, so that Rav Moshe has a tshuva that we went over at one point. Can a person dye their hair in order to be able to pass himself off as younger to get a job? And Rav Moshe's conclusion is it depends what kind of job it is. Seriously, because if it's a job which requires manual labor, and the reason why they're eliminating people of his age bracket is because they feel that he will lack the stamina in order to be able to schlep and do whatever they want him to do. So then you would not be allowed to dye your hair. But if it's just because of ageism, right, and that they don't want to hire someone who's, let's say, a more mature person because they want a more vibrant, exciting office atmosphere, and that really is discrimination because of age. So then he says, but you can do the job just as capably as a younger person, then Rav Moshe says you are allowed to dye your hair. Yeah.
Makeup and in general for women.
What's the
women wearing makeup?
It's not a kavod habriot issue, but
yes,
the Gemara says Ein Isha El Illinois, that Hashem created women, Hashem created the fairer sex, right, so that they could give aesthetic pleasure to their husbands. In other words, there is something to be said about beauty. And that's the reason why it's been a long-standing tradition in Jewish culture to have perfume and to have cosmetics and jewelry. I forgot. Sorry. Thanks a lot, Paul. Thanks a lot. Right. So That for that reason is because we do believe that aesthetics enhance a person. The Gemara says, Isha na'ah, there are three things that are marchiven daito shel adam, that three things in life that expand a person's horizons. They make a person have a greater sense of breadth of thought, and they give him a machaya. And one of those three things is a beautiful wife. And so therefore, that's the reason why cosmetics are sanctioned. Yes.
Are body piercings included in any way with the
No, body piercings don't seem to be prohibited by the Gemara at all, or by the Torah, because look at what happened with the story of the golden calf. Everyone took off their nose rings and their earrings, and there seems to be no sense of disfigurement. You're obviously not allowed to disfigure your body. That's one of the things it's one of the components of Ketovet Ka'aka, is that you make a permanent change in your physical appearance for your deity. The Torah does prohibit you disfiguring yourself if it's for mourning, if it's to express your grief. So none of that really applies to body piercings, unless it's really, really unusual and painful, which we don't even want to think about because it makes you cringe. Yeah.
So,
Yes.
Where tattooing in the non-Jewish world is rampant. I mean, almost everyone seems to have a tattoo these days. It's only prohibited if it's idolatry.
So a Gentile is not prohibited from tattooing himself or herself. There's no prohibition whatsoever. It's not one of the Shiva mitzvos b'nei Noach. It's not one of the Noachide commandments, at least not that I'm aware.
It lines up under idolatry.
So you would have to make the argument that he's doing it for idolatry in order for it to be prohibited, because even nowadays Gentiles are enjoined against worshiping idols. So if you could find, let's say, somewhere in India or somewhere in Africa where they're still worshiping their deity by tattooing themselves, then you could make the argument that it's a problem. But here in North America, where people
put a cross or something like that.
The funniest thing is you see on social media every once in a while where a guy will put a pasuk in Hebrew on his arm, like a Gentile, because he wants to show his love for Israel and the Bible or the Jewish people or whatever it is. And he's and it's even funnier when it gets misspelled. I don't.
But I presume if a Jew did that, they would be able to remove it if it had Hashem's name.
That's an interesting shaila. If you have Yud-K, Vav-K placed on your skin, would you be allowed to have it removed? That's an interesting shaila. I don't know the answer to that question.
Particular motions against men coloring their hair. But you're saying it's only allowed.
As I said, if it's for the if it's parnasa, yeah. I don't think Rav Moshe advocates coloring your hair, if memory serves me correctly. He says if you need it for parnasa, that you have to be able to have a strong utilitarian argument for it to be done. What?
bias.
Yeah. Okay, Mark.
Mentioned earlier about the tattooing a slave. Is it a Jewish slave or non-Nite, or does it matter?
It's a good question. It seems to be a Canaanite slave that the case is being addressed in the Talmud.
We non-Jew.
No, the reason it's permitted, the reason you're permitted to tattoo your slave.
No, but if I want to open up a tattoo parlor, can I take non-Jews only?
I see. Would it be permitted for me to place tattoos on non-Jews? It's an interesting shaila.
No.
Yeah, you got to find something to do in your retirement,
Tell the
right?
Jew to go elsewhere.
Selling trade meat.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you're allowed to sell. Well, it's not so clear that you're allowed to sell treif meat to non-Jews. It's not so clear. We just had that tshuva in our Choshen Mishpat shir. Yeah, there seems to be a rabbinic prohibition in peddling in non-kosher food. Yeah. Yeah, I was just asking Dr. Rosenberg about that. He was telling me that Dr. Rosenberg is a dermatologist. So he was telling me that it never looks the same. Is that right?
That's right. There are different kinds of ink, or how they're put in, what level. It's destructive, burning laser, and it's just like a crinkled looking mess.
a crinkled looking mess.
That's-
Yes, that's the medical term, yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that in itself is a question, is a person mechuyav to remove a tattoo? It seems from the literature that there's no chiyuv to remove a tattoo. It's that if a person is embarrassed, because let's say, you know that famous story about the fellow who goes to the mikveh on Erev Yom Kippur, and he's a Baal Tshuva and he's covered with tattoos. And he does his best to put the towel over him in such a way so that no one should see what he's got on his body when he goes in and comes out of the mikveh. And all of a sudden, as he's coming out, he slips, the towel drops, and everyone can see his tattoo. And then all of a sudden, an older man comes over, gives him his hand. He says, "Don't worry, I have a tattoo also." And so a lot of Holocaust survivors had the option of removing their tattoos. And they specifically didn't because they wanted to use that to bear witnesses to what mankind is capable of doing. Okay, so I think we'll hold it here for tonight. Thanks for joining us. Again, thank you to RMEDS and to the Race family. And Mirz Hashem, when's the next shiur? Is it next Wednesday night? Or is it in 2 weeks? Is it in a week or is it in 2 weeks?
Rabbi Lesher, is it confirmed? Other Wednesdays.
Next year is March 19th.
March 19th.
No, it's in March 5th with Rabbi Rothbart.
Oh, no, sorry.